So tonight I'm going to talk about Jewish identity. I am reminded of a true story involving one of the students of our early childhood program, as retold to me by a teacher. This child had a parent who was Jewish and one who was not. And a classmate asked the child, "So what are you?" He responded, "I am half Jewish and half normal." What is Jewish? What is normal? This and other related issues I'll invite you to consider with me tonight. But before going into the sermon, I'd like to dedicate the sermon to the memory of my teacher, friend, and colleague, Professor Clark Williamson, a faithful Christian theologian and scholar who was committed to confronting anti-Semitism and eliminating Anti-Judaism from the teachings of the church. Clark died on June 26th. His memory lives on with the disciples he raised and the example he modeled. I am grateful. So a group of elderly Jews gather in a cafe each morning. They drink coffee. They sit for hours discussing the state of the world. Their conversations often get depressing. One day, one of the men startles his friends. "You know what?" he says. "I'm an optimist." The others are shocked. One of them notices his somber face and says, "If you're an optimist, how come you look so worried?" He says, "So you think it's easy to be an optimist?" We are living through unprecedented times, but I want to be an optimist. The arc of Jewish history bends in the direction of hope. If racism is America's original sin, anti-Semitism is the original sin of Western civilization. Both are endemic and systemic. They are viruses that resurge and mutate with variant expressions and force. Now, anti-Judaism began as religious prejudice that informed nascent Christianity and later Islam. Anti-Judaism evolved from religious hatred to racial hatred, culminating in the lethal anti-Semitism of Nazi ideology. And more recently, anti-Semitism has mutated into Anti-Zionism, relegating Israel to a pariah state among the family of nations. A social media post I saw recently by an otherwise moderate religious leader notes, "When I think of the Holocaust, my heart cries for the Jews, the victims of the Holocaust. But when I look at the rigid rulers in Israel, I see a creation of Hitler." Grim centuries of persecution do not translate into respect for Jewish life today. In her book, People Love Dead Jews, Dara Horn recounts harrowing stories that highlight the world's guilt and fascination with the Holocaust and with dead Jews. Evidently, some prefer their Jews as victims than as victors. Now, someone suggested that had Descartes been Jewish, he would have proclaimed, "I worry, therefore I am." And you all remember the quintessential Jewish telegram, "Start worrying, details to follow." But we cannot build an identity based on worrying, on the attitudes of others towards us. Despite rising anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, we cannot affirm who we are by being anti-Semites or anti-Zionists. What is it that we stand for? How do we shape and communicate a positive, hopeful, joyful, authentic Jewish identity to our sons and our daughters? Deborah Lipstadt, who is the administration's newly appointed ambassador to combat anti-Semitism, reminds us that anti-Semitism is adaptable and thrives in any hospitable environment. She writes, "When it comes to anti-Semitism, the right and the left find common ground." And racial conflict in America has afforded both the right and the left opportunities to seize on anti-Jewish sentiment. You see, after the Holocaust, the Western world felt embarrassed by anti-Semitism's lethal outcome. The birth of Israel through edict of the United Nations helped to assuage the world's guilty conscience. But as Israel prospered and defeated Arab aggressions, as American Jews attained economic security, social acceptance, and political influence, Jews in Israel began to lose their victim status. Palestinians have emerged as the new victims, and Israel's image as a beleaguered nation has faded. Despite the vicious actions of Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel is portrayed by many in the left as the aggressor, a symbol of Western imperialism and colonialism. I don't know if you heard it, but the Taliban recently announced that it wanted to establish relations with every country in the world except Israel. I say, what a compliment. Israel, like all other countries, can certainly be faulted for many political and social inequities. But the malicious charge that Israel is an apartheid state is intent on casting Israel as a racist and colonialist society. And this pernicious accusation has been embraced by campus activists and social justice movements on the far left in promoting the BDS agenda. Yet, Israel is a place where Jews and Arabs, including Palestinians, receive excellent equal care at Hadassah and at hospitals across the country. It is a country where Jewish and Arab students do groundbreaking university research together, where Arab citizens can sit as justices on the Supreme Court, serve in the army and in the Foreign Diplomatic Corps, where an Arab party is integral to Israel's new governing coalition, where Ibtisam Marana Menuhin, an Arab-Israeli filmmaker and politician who is married to an Israeli Jew, serves as a member of the Knesset for the Labor Party, where a Jew can be a member of the Joint List Arab Party, where one of the best high schools in Israel is in a Druze village and was led by an Arab educator, Ali Salalha, who is now a member of the Knesset for the Progressive Meretz Party, where there are Arab, Israeli beauty queens, prominent literary figures, and leading pop singers. Have you heard of the Jerusalem Youth Chorus? It is a music and dialogue program for Israeli and Palestinian youth from East and West Jerusalem to grow together in dialogue and in song. Truth is, the only country in the Middle East where Arab citizens can participate fully in a real and contentious democracy is Israel. Regrettably, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been conflated by many with American racial politics, the relationship of white supremacy versus blacks and peoples of color in our country. This inflammatory mindset is driving much of current anti-Semitic and anti-Israel sentiment. For the far right, we are not white or Christian enough. For the far left, we are not perceived as people of color or regarded as victims enough. Sadly, significant numbers of American Jews have bought into this false equation and feel estranged from Israel. Many young Jews no longer regard peoplehood as a core component of their Jewish identity, and while standing for other oppressed and marginalized peoples of the world, they have no problem distancing themselves from Israel. Many even stand on synagogue pulpits, self-righteously proclaiming a Judaism which they regard as stripped of unsavory, ethnocentric, and colonialist baggage. Jean-Paul Sartre, writing after the end of World War II, poignantly observed that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. In fact, history and literature document that there is anti-Semitism even in country where no Jews live. The late Amos Oz, distinguished Israeli novelist and intellectual, recalled his father's observation that prior to the Holocaust, Europeans would say, "Jews, go to Palestine." In our time, the call is, "Jews, out of Palestine." The message to Jews, said Oz, don't be here, don't be there. That is, don't be. As the parent religion of both Christianity and Islam, Judaism has borne the brunt of the criticism and rejection of its daughter faiths. When all else fails, blame mom. In correspondence with our good friend, Rabbi Richard Hirsch, Sandy and I have concurred with regret that when feminist theology surfaced in the 70s, Christians blamed the Jews for patriarchy. The environmentalist movement blames the Old Testament for climate abuse. Who is responsible for slavery? Well, the Jews. For homophobia? Again, the Old Testament. Colonialism is just the latest evil for which Jews are blamed. Jewish guilt has taken a whole new meaning. So is there room for optimism? Optimism is not for the short-sighted. That's messianism, utopianism. I am talking about trust and hope in humanity's better nature. I'm talking about the wisdom of our heritage and the genius of the Jewish people to grow and to prosper. I'm talking about our capacity to contribute to and to benefit from the best of the American democratic tradition, strong in its freedoms, generous in its commitment to diversity and equality. And I have the same hopes for a secure, democratic, and pluralistic Israel. It is time for American Jews to stop regarding ourselves as apologists or surrogates for Israel. Israel's existence doesn't need to be constantly justified. Israel is an independent, self-critical, democratic nation in a region that is still a seabed of autocracy. Israel's Declaration of Independence reads, In the land of Israel, the Jewish people was born. In this land, their spiritual, religious, and national character was shaped. Jews are indigenous to the land. The modern state of Israel is the fulfillment of a historic birthright and national aspiration. But there were and are others also living in the land. So Israel's declaration further states, I quote, "The state of Israel will devote itself to develop the land for the good of all its inhabitants." Israel should always strive to be true to its founding vision. The prophetic promise of liberty, justice, and peace should be the inheritance of all Israeli, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and others alike. Israel is both a refuge and a dream, a complex and challenging political reality. Israel's future as a Jewish state requires it to make important short-term sacrifices for the sake of long-term benefits. And while Israel's sovereignty and security are non-negotiable, Israel serves herself and Jews around the world best as it labors to normalize coexistence with its Arab citizens and peace with its Palestinian neighbors. And through the Abrahamic Accords, it has begun to do so with nations that were once deemed enemies. Occupation and increased settlement are not the answer. Even as Israel labors to make peace with its Palestinian neighbors and to assure the legal and socioeconomic equality of its Arab citizens, it also needs to normalize its relationship with diaspora Jewry. The stranglehold of ultra-Orthodoxy is not only choking of Israeli citizens, but is dismissive and insulting of Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, secular Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. The abuse hurled at non-Orthodox egalitarian services in the Kotel, the Western Wall, is moral violence. Israel takes pride in the victory of Olympic gold medalist Artem Dolgpiat, yet he cannot marry Jewishly in the state of Israel because his mother is not Jewish. Such archaic understandings of Jewish religion and civil rights are inexcusable in a democratic state. We should never minimize the significance of anti-Semitism and of anti-Zionism, but they should not paralyze nor define us. Rather, they should energize us to live fuller, more informed, and engaged Jewish lives. We need to cultivate a Jewish identity that is not defensive. We need an informed, genuine, wholesome, natural response to the challenges of living in a society that is becoming more and more divided and divisive, more interested in ice cream, simple solutions, than in the complexity and nuance of real living. We need to own and celebrate and proclaim a Judaism that is affirmative of individual rights, while at the same time grounded in the ethics of group responsibility, what Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan called the religion of ethical nationhood. And so, we join our country's struggle against racism and climate change because we are Jews, because our tradition demands it. We need to accept criticism and be willing to be self-critical. If we somehow thought that we were not all in the same boat, the coronavirus has taught us otherwise. Hatred is as effective a tool as the virus for drilling a hole in that boat. Both can destroy us as a people as a democracy, as a world. One of the most misunderstood passages in the Bible is the oft-quoted, "Yea, do I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil." This verse from Psalm 23 has nothing to do with death. The mistaken English translation goes back to the 17th century King James Bible. The Hebrew means, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of deep darkness." It is not talking about the valley of death. It is about life and its difficulties, its struggles and adversities. And we all face illness and conflict and loss, emotional and spiritual pain. Collectively, we deal with anti-Semitism, division, and a worldwide pandemic. Well, Psalm 23 is not about death. It is about hope. Now, hope does not guarantee that it will all turn out right. It means that even if everything is not the way we want it, we can still walk through the valley of darkness with the support of others, with the guidance of science, with the wisdom of faith. David Ben-Gurion, the inveterate pragmatist, first prime minister of the state of Israel, said, "In order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles." At a difficult time, the tzaddik, the Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, would teach his disciples, "Friends, do not despair. When a difficult time is upon us, joy must fill the air. Our hope is never lost." And so in 2012, Elie Wiesel said to a college graduating class that after World War II, he was pessimistic. He said the world will never learn. Otherwise, how is one to explain that there is still racism in the world? How is one to explain that there is still anti-Semitism in the world? If Auschwitz has not cured the world of hatred, Wiesel asked, what will? And still, Wiesel counseled the students, despair is never a solution. Hatred is never an option. Hope is not a gift from God to us. Hope is a gift, an offering that we human beings give to one another. Let this be the gift we give each other on this new year. I'm optimistic.